My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today, as I am every Friday for the virtual reading group. We are reading The Human Condition. The Human Condition. Many people think Hannah Arendt's great opus. It's certainly her most theoretical book, theoretical in a sense of trying to offer some reflections, to think what she is doing, to think what we are doing in the world as human beings, not human nature, but as human beings who are conditioned by that world. And just to remind ourselves about where we are in the book, we're about to start chapter 2, which is on labor. The book can be broken up into, I think, 3 parts. Chapters, the prologue and the introduction and chapter 1 are one part. They look at the book as as a book about modernity and the modern age. And then the second part of the book is these 3 chapters on labor, work, and action. What Arendt calls the 3 fundamental activities of humanity as it has emerged and as it has been conditioned in the human condition. Just to remind ourselves, the book in German is called the Vita Activa. That was Arendt's original title for it, not the human condition, the life of action, or the active life. And she says there are 3 fundamental activities. All of these are activities or actions of what it means to be human. Labor, work, and action. And so we're now about to enter that part of the book where she explains and interrogates these 3 activities of being human. And so what I want us to remember is that all 3 of these activities, labor, work, and action, are human activities. You have to some degree, being human means to labor, to work, and to act. And this is deeply important for Arendt. That doesn't mean that if you don't labor, and you're a complete, aristocrat, you're not a human being. You are, but you're missing out on something that she considers to be part of one of the fundamental activities of being human. At the same token, if you are someone who only labors and does nothing else, again, she thinks you're still human, but you're missing out on activities of the human condition. So this first activity that we're going to look at, labor, I think often is thought of as the lowest. And in some ways, that's right. Although what she's going to argue is that in the modern world, laboring has become the highest activity of what it means to be human. And so as we said when we read the introduction to the book is about the Vita Activa. And it's about not only the elevating of the Vita Activa over the Vita Contemplativa in the Aristotelian sense, that whereas for Aristotle and for many pre-moderns, the life of the mind was actually higher than the life of action. So one inversion that Arendt is addressing is how the Vita Activa has now supplanted the Vita Contemplativa, that we now consider acting more important than thinking. But the other reversal, or the other inversion that she talks about, is that within the Vita Activa, traditionally labor had been the lowest and action had been the highest activity. And that in the modern age, we're going to see an inversion of that, such that labor becomes the height of what it means to be human. So this section on labor is actually quite important. It's not a throwaway section. She takes it very seriously that laboring is A, an essential part of the human condition, and B, is becoming, has become, or both is becoming and has become the dominant activity of being human in our world. And so when the book asks us to think what we are doing, part of what it asks us to do is think what we are doing as we more and more focus on ourselves as laborers, as what you will call animal laborans, the laboring animal, instead of the animal rationalis, the rational animal or the thinking animal, or the active animal. With the other, and so that's, I think, the crux of this. And thus, she begins this chapter with a very short little introduction that you can see as cute or meaningful or both, about her connection to Marx. And she says in this chapter, Karl Marx will be criticized, right? And she's going to criticize. She's going to be very critical of Marx, and yet she sees Marx as the great thinker of labor. She sees Marx as the thinker more than anyone else who has understood and impacted the modern age. And so, to the extent labor is elevated within the vita activa to be the highest activity of the human condition, it's in large part because of Marx. And so this is a criticism of Marx in some sort, and yet it's also a celebration of Marx. And she says, she has this wonderful line that all these people who criticize Marx today have been making a living off them for God knows how long. And as she quotes Benjamin Constant about Rousseau, certainly I shall avoid the company of detractors of a great man. If I happen to agree with them on a single point, I grow suspicious of myself. And in order to console myself for having seemed to be of their opinion, I feel I must disavow and keep those false friends away from me as much as I can. She's not here portraying herself as a capitalist or free market critic of Marx, right? That's not what's going on. She's criticizing Marx in his philosophical, at the very root of what she sees to be Marxism or socialism, which is the idea, A, that man comes to be through his or her own labor. That man is a laboring animal, and that is the most important aspect of man. And that second, in being a laboring animal, what man creates in his labor is a social world, is a gesellschaftliche Welt, a world in which what matters is the life of the species life. And thus what doesn't matter is the individual. And she sees this as Marx's utopia. And she sees it as the essence of labor. The essence of labor is to produce productive labor. It's to produce goods that we can consume so that we can live, so that we can produce more, so that we can consume, so that we can live, so we can produce more, so we can consume, so we can live, with the height of it to be that we create this cycle in which we all live together, and we live in a social world that is stable, That's the Marxist dream, a socialized society, a communist society, a communal society, um, in which all can live comfortably and equally to some degree. Um, this kind of uh, equation of labor equals life equals fertility equals world equals consumption equals life equals consumption equals life equals consumption is what she thinks is the goal of Marxism. And she thinks it's what has largely become our goal in life today, which is why this section will end. This chapter will end with a section on consumption and the consumptive society. What she thinks Marx's mistake was, in some way, is that he thought that when we created this life of ease and consumption where we all were comfortable, there would be an opportunity for human flourishing, right? As Marx says, we go fishing, we'd play games, we'd talk about philosophy in the evening or whatever. And she says that was a dream. What we've created is simply a consumption society where we work more, labor more, consume more, labor more, consume more. And that Marx was simply wrong, that when you gave people a basis of living, they would be satisfied with that, and they would exercise their other higher faculties of meaningfulness and community and art, etc. And she says, no, that's not what's happened. We've created just a more disposable and consumptive society. Okay, that's the overarching scope of chapter 2 on labor. We are reading today sections 11, 12, and 13. 12 and 13 are very short. We'll focus a little bit on section 11 today. She begins with the linguistic derivation of the words for labor. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. It's an interesting insight. Basically, her insight is that there's, in every society in the world, or every society in most, and certainly the Western ones that she knows, so let's be honest, there is a distinction between the word for labor and work. We have it in English, we have it in German, Arbeit für Labor, Werken or Werk for work. In French, travailler for labor, and ouvrir for work. It's in Greek, it's in Latin. And so she says, why has this not been really noticed? Why have people not paid attention to it? And so, in the ancient world, right? She always goes back to the ancient world. She says they largely didn't notice it because they thought both labor and work were sort of demeaning. And they thought that what mattered was to be a citizen, to be free from labor and work. And so they just didn't pay too much attention to this distinction. The first theorists, she says, the first theorists who really did pay attention to distinction in some way, or at least who saw it in some way, were Adam Smith and Karl Marx. And she says that this distinction emerged in their distinction between productive and unproductive labor. We're on page 85 here. Smith and Marx elevate labor, and they begin this modern elevation of labor because of its productivity, the fact that it produces things. So for Marx, she thinks one of his greatest theoretical economic insights, political economic insights, is his discovery of what he calls Arbeitskraft, or labor power. The fact that some people can produce from their labor more than they need. And when those people are exploited by capitalists or by slaveholders, right? You can have Arbeitskraft in a slaveholding society or in a capitalist society. She thinks they're somewhat similar. What they both do is they exploit the excess or surplus labor, in Marx's term, of some to produce the necessities to sustain life for all. But this excess labor power, she says, never produces anything besides consumable necessities. Again, now we're on page 88. Why is that? That's actually an important question that I'd love to come back to in the discussion. Why is it that Arbeitskraft produces nothing but consumable necessities? It doesn't have to be that way, I don't think. Marx clearly thought it would produce leisure and thus time for poetry and art and other things. Arendt is skeptical. And so let me just say that for Arendt, again, as I said before, she sees Marx as having this idea that labor creates man. Labor distinguishes man from animals. So in the German ideology, one of Marx's earlier philosophical texts, he writes, the first historical act of this individual, namely mankind, by which he distinguishes himself from an animal, is not that he thinks, but that he begins to produce his means of subsistence. This is in the footnote 14 that she's in this text. And so Marx and Smith see man as this laboring animal, as someone who produces means not only of their subsistence, but of civilizations or societies' subsistence. And the goal of communism for Marx is then to free man from all labor or work, to enter a society where we can largely be relaxed and free and fish and play poetry and not have to labor or work. This is one of the contradictions of our laboring society that Arendt points to over and again in the introduction and then again in this chapter, that in a sense, one of the tragedies of the modern age for her is that we are a laboring society in which the goal is not to labor, and yet we still have nothing else to do. I mean, to the extent we end up doing what Marx wanted us to do, which is having enough so that we don't have to work, what do? We get bored. And so we consume a lot and then we go back to work because we have nothing else to do. This is the loss of the higher activities that she is worried about and she sees as part of what it means to live in a labor glorified world. As I said, for her, the idea that one of the real core ideas in Marx is this idea that we create a socialized humanity. We alienate ourselves. The alienation of mankind, or the alienation of man from mention, from humanity, is that man is, in her reading of Marx, amalgamated into a social existence. Communism, and man, therefore, will come to, quote, live and to labor for life like a bee. He's got nothing else to do. He just keeps living and laboring and laboring and living. And this creates a kind of socialized humanity where we're all like worker bees or drones, but we don't have things that distinguish us or make us unique with the loss of action. And so this is the sketch she's offering in this first section of this longer chapter on labor. She'll be drawing it out throughout the rest of the chapter of what it means to live in a laboring society. I'll point to one interesting little tidbit at the end of this section 11, where she talks about the loss of distinctions between skilled and unskilled labor on page 90, and then the loss of distinction between manual and intellectual work on page 90 to 91. Something I think is really quite fascinating. She's arguing here that thinking is like labor, insofar as that labor leads to no things that last in the world. It just leads to consumption. Thinking also never leads to anything that lasts in the world. It's what you think is in your head. It's not in the world. And so thinking is a kind of laboring. And we lose this distinction between manual and intellectual work, with the difference that those who think can, through the combination of remembrance, of remembering what they think, and the skill of writing or producing artworks, making artworks that last, can actually create works and become artists or workers, and not laborers. Mere thinkers are like laborers, but thinkers who put works into the world, she says, are different. One of the real tragedies in her mind of the modern age is that most thinkers never become workers. They become what she calls bureaucrats. And so on page 92 to 93, she talks about how in the modern world, intellectuals have largely been reduced to white-collar workers and bureaucrats. And she says that, like the bureaucratization of the Roman Empire that embraced intellectual services, a wonderful quote, intellectuals who don't produce works, who don't produce books or artworks or whatever it is that they produce, she says, are increasingly bureaucrats or Smith's menial servants, Adam Smith's menial servants. These intellectuals who are servants, she says, function not for life, not to produce consumption things that we consume, as do other servants, but simply to, quote, care for the upkeep of the various gigantic bureaucratic machines whose processes consume their services and devour their products as quickly and mercilessly as the biological life process itself. It's an extraordinary condemnation of modern intellectuals. She offers a number of examples. She says the army and soldiers produce nothing. They simply are a kind of massive bureaucracy and machine that consumes services and devours their products as quickly and mercilessly as the biological process devours consumable goods. She says white-collar jobs similarly produce nothing. And she says actors and orators produce nothing, interestingly enough, along with intellectual bureaucrats. It's a claim, and I think the one we should talk more about, but it's a claim that to the extent intellectuals become part of a bureaucratic machine, they become part of an organic process that seeks to sustain itself without ever producing works that are meaningful. We can talk about it. It's certainly something that is it's an idea that is constant in her work throughout her life, and here she ties it to this idea of labor. Section 12 is on the thing character of the world, and in many ways it's sort of a theoretical contrast between labor and work. So if labor produces consumable goods or makes consumable goods that disappear and don't last, work is going to make things that last, and the highest form of work is going to be the work of art that lasts. And she's making this distinction here in section 12. I think we've talked a lot about this, but I guess what I'll say now is the reliability and durability, and thus the world that is in between us, that unites us, and that gives us a world in which we can appear to others, and thus allows us to act, this is the world of work and of goods, of durable goods. That for her is so important. And she's here simply making a distinction between the thing character of the world over and against consumable objects. Finally, chapter 13, labor and life, is really making this distinction, this equalization, this formula that I mentioned earlier, that life equals nature equals labor. So she makes a distinction now between zoology and biology, right? It's a classic distinction. Zoology is the study of animal life, and biology is the study of human life, which is why most of what goes by the name of biology today is an oxymoron, at least from a Greek perspective. Within zoology, or the life cycle, there's a cycle of labor, consumption of life that I discussed. Life is cyclical, viewed naturally. In biology, we don't live cyclically. We live in a world that is linear. We start with birth and we end with death. And as a result, it's not a world of laboring and consumption. It's a world of meaning. It's a world that has to be told as a story. And so she says on page 97, the chief characteristic of a specifically human life is that it is always full of events which ultimately become told as a story. A human life as a biological life is a life that lives as something with a beginning, middle, and end. And to the extent we live in this communal society of cyclical life, we lose that storiness. We lose the distinction of our humanity, and that's very much what is much of the worry underlying this chapter on labor. Labor, she'll say on page 98 to 99, is man's metabolism with nature, quoting Marx, in whose process nature's material is adapted by a change of form to the wants of man, so that labor has incorporated itself with its subject. It's a cycle that never ends. In labor, man sort of merges in with nature. And thus labor and consumption, she says, are two sides of life as a zoological process. All right, I think that's enough for now for me to just as an opening introduction. Let me stop and throw it open to questions. Reminder that you can continue a discussion in the chat. I'm largely going to have to focus on answering and talking with people in, to some extent, of real life on Zoom. But you know, I encourage you to both raise your hand and ask questions, and you can try out your questions in the chat and then ask them as they become clear to you. Robert McKay, you're up first.
Okay. I have a question about translation. First of all, I should ask, this is about section 12 exclusively, so would you like me to wait?
No, you can go ahead. Just tell me the page number you're on, and
okay,
I'll find...
page 93. But
okay.
Before I go on, I need some help with a question of translation.
Okay.
Back on page 9.
Back on 9. Okay.
Way back.
Yeah. Go ahead.
She's introducing the phrase the human condition. And she says, I'm going to read 3 sentences. The human condition comprehends more than the conditions under which life has been given to man. Men are conditioned beings because everything they come in contact with turns immediately into a condition of their existence. The world in which the vita activa spends itself consists of things produced by human activity. The question is, does the German translation for condition or conditioned, is that Bedingung?
I would imagine so. Someone have the German open.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah,
it's Bedingung.
it's Bedingung. That's what I would imagine. Thank you.
Okay, well, I've got a little more.
Okay.
First of all, you should notice that the presence in the sentences I just read of the word world and the word things. And secondly, in the German word Bedingung, condition, the central part of it is the word ding,
Yeah.
thing. So when we come to what we read for today, section 12, the thing character of the world, there are those two words again.
Yep.
And that's surely an odd phrase in English, at least. And I'm just a beginner with Heidegger, but it sure sounds like Heidegger to me. And it seems that she's been dropping quite a lot of phrases like that without ever mentioning him. That's okay.
Yeah. So you're right, Robert. And by the way, that when she says something like the thing character of the world, there's no doubt that there's a connection to Bedingung. It's the conditioned thing character of the world. You know, I don't know if I'm going to find it right now, but she does write to Martin Heidegger when she publishes this book in 1958, and say to him that it's missing something, which is a dedication to him, and that she could not have written the book without him, and without his teaching. But she says that for obvious reasons, she could no longer dedicate it to him. Reasons being his involvement with the Nazis. You know, I think you're absolutely right to see a connection. So much in this book is indebted to I don't want to say indebted to Heidegger, because I don't think that's right. Indebted to her confrontation with Heidegger.
Yep.
And that's mostly going to come to the fore in the last chapter on the Vita Activa and the modern age. So much of that is a response to and a confrontation with Heidegger and his thinking about science and technology and technique. But here, there's no doubt that her understanding of the distinction between labor and work, Arbeit und Werken, and the das Bedingung, the dingliche character, the thingly character of the world, is certainly, I think, has some resonances with Heidegger, although it's not something he ever specifically talked about.
Actually, he did.
Well, he has an essay. I mean, he has an essay called Das Ding, but
right.
it's not about, it's, you know, that's not about this. The Das Ding is about what happens to things in the age of science. And the
A lot of it is.
well, it's about it's about the transformation of Das Ding into Bestand. And that's an important element. And it's something that Arendt, I think, is thinking about. You know, but she's not making that argument here. And so I don't want to say, oh, she's just doing Heidegger, because I don't think that's what's going on.
No, you're right. I have a little more, but I've taken up enough time. So let's hear other people.
Okay. If you want to come back, you can. Yeah. And I think I think we should definitely, there will be plenty of opportunity to talk explicitly about the connection between Arendt and Heidegger in chapter 6 in sections like 30 to 35, where she's talking about Galileo and Descartes and the internalization of the world. Again, it's not the same argument Heidegger's making, but it could not have been made without her reading of Heidegger. And I think those who've read Heidegger will see that when we get to those pages. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about whether the section on labor is Heidegger. And she doesn't. I had one mention of Heidegger in my notes in when I was looking through this, but well, anyway, if it comes up again, we'll bring it up. Thank you, though. It's an important insight. I think that the general insight of the Heideggerian push in this book is right. Klaus.
Roger, the one area where work and labor comes up in Heidegger in a way that arguably is similar to what we've read so far is in the origin of the artwork and the discussion of the shoes and the laboring of the peasant and the work and this Werken and the artwork.
Yeah, I mean, I think Heidegger certainly speaks a lot about Werk and how the work works. But
he also speaks of the labor when the peasant returns from the field, and the shoes resemble that. So that's where those two concepts come up, but they don't come up in the way that Arendt is bringing them up here.
Right. No, I mean, I think they certainly come up. I'm just trying to think if it's something. I'm trying to, there's been some people, including, I mean, primarily Pachin Markel, has been really interested in this question of where Arendt gets this distinction in work and labor and how she came up with it. Because it's really, I mean, it's people sort of don't pay too much attention to it when they read this book, but it's very innovative. I mean, no one before had really done this. And Arendt does, and she, ties it to language and things. And I think in many ways that's where she get it. But, there is really a question of, has anyone else seen this distinction before? And I'm not sure. And I don't think, I mean, again, Heidegger talks about labor and talks about work, but I'm not sure. I don't see it in him that this would have been a distinction that was so meaningful to him. I mean, the Zuhandenheit, I think the ready to hand is something related to the thing character of the world. So we can think about it in those ways. All right, Klaus, let's move on and maybe move away from Heidegger for a second.
Yeah, my question also is not in that direction, although I am really interested in the connection between the two, and I just want to, for everyone who's sort of listening, that I think one additional place aside from das Ding and die Frage der Technik is also just a short set of lectures he gave, which is called Einblick in das, was ist. So something like a insight into that which is, and there he actually sort of, I think, sails a lot closer to things around the circular motion of labor. Excuse me. So I think that's another reference point. Roger, what I wanted to ask about, and I keep on coming back to this, reading this book again after sort of an intermission of 10 years, and having read Hegel in between, it strikes me that he is sort of conspicuously absent from her writing, also on these things, even though he seems to actually talk about what the connection is between labor and freedom, and how we create a society in which we become free through being able to labor and labor together. He seems in some way to have a much more optimistic view on some of these things, while also identifying difficulties on concepts like wealth and so on. The fact that towards the end of Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts. I don't know what that's in English, but his
Philosophy of
work on,
law, the philosophy of
Yeah.
right.
And where he talks about the difficulty of having capital rather than producing goods. So I think he becomes quite concrete in that sense. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on why is it that on the one hand she seems to say that we need to be free, we need to do more than just labor. That seems to be clear in order to be complete human or to do all those three things. But at the same time, she doesn't seem to spend a lot of time on the benefits or the upsides of living in a society where we labor together. And I mean that in the sense, not how she describes it, but the fact that someone produces milk and only milk, but then someone down the street produces bread and only bread, and the advantages that sort of grow from that, and that becomes beyond what we can talk about the objective world as like a precondition for us being able to meet as humans. It seems to me that the liberation from the biological necessity also comes from this division of tasks, which ties back to this Arbeitskraft concept. So I just wonder if she is like overly negative on the point of view. I know you want to say that she describes the phenomena, but she does seem to downplay some of the let's say quote unquote productive aspects of dividing labor up.
That's a great question, Klaus. So she talks a lot about the division of labor, obviously in section 16, which I guess we'll read in 2 weeks. We'll have to get into that, but just to give you, like, on page 121, she'll say, it is true that the enormous improvement in our labor tools, right? And then she goes through all the things that you've just been talking about, has made the twofold labor of life, the effort of its sustenance, and the pain of giving birth easier and less painful than it has ever been. This, of course, has not eliminated compulsion from laboring activity, and the need and necessity from human life. But she does think it's helped. And I mean, obviously no one's going to deny that. And I think you're absolutely right to point to that. There's certainly a lot of good that has come from, advances in productivity and division of labor, and technology. And I don't think she's in any way would deny that or even oblivious to it. I think she's quite aware of it. This is not a book against labor. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting about this chapter is, that she's going to say that those of us who don't labor and, spend our time hiring out servants or workers to do our labor for us are missing out, right? But so, yeah, I mean, so let's just stipulate that labor and capitalist production has given us benefits, made life easier. So what's the what do you want besides that stipulation, which I think is there? Do you want
so I think she spends a whole lot of time talking about that the physical world or the objective world is the scene in which human life can happen, in which action can take place. And she talks about this image that if the objective world were to disappear, it's like being that the table between people all of a sudden disappeared and you were weirdly related to each other. And that seems to place quite rightly, to my mind, an importance and significance on the objective world. It just seems to me that the importance and significance of organizing our labor in such a way that we get to do other things, and also that we get to exercise quote unquote small freedoms, like saying, what do I want to eat for dinner tonight, or something like that. actually becomes an equally important precondition to be able to do those other things, be it do art or do important political things. And it just seems to me that the significance is much higher placed on the objective world than it is on this, I'm going to call it the division of labor. So I think what she talks about when she talks about division of labor is something else, but the fact that people take up different jobs in the world to cover different needs, and the totality of that I think serves as the basis without which we couldn't act as humans in the way that she understands.
No, I think it's good. I mean, I think the argument she's making, which may very well be overstated, I think, is that when we make enough and we have enough surplus labor and we earn money and we end up eating, the newest kind of hand pounded meat from grass-fed this than this, we're spending our money once again on consumption and not on things that last, and not on works and not on actions. And her argument is that this economic miracle that you said gives us little, enjoyments is being, I think, is being squandered, would be one way to put it, because we have become so laboring, in our core, that we just consume what we can and then go and labor more. That's, and okay, so is that overstated? I mean, obviously, people are going to say, oh, well, there's people who go out and build buildings, and there's people who go out and make art. And of course there are. And she's not going to deny that. And she's going to talk about that in the next chapter. So what is the argument? The argument is that they are lost souls in the wilderness, right? The argument is that those are exceptions, that those are unique individuals, but that our basic world is one in which we labor, consume, and anything that is outside of that is seen as an exception. And so she's going to say that artists are going to be seen as sort of like the exceptions of our time. They're sort of out of time in the modern age. I don't know if you agree with that. I don't know if any of you agree with that. But that's, I think, the bite of her argument.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Ayala.
Yes, first of all, Klaus, Emil Durkheim, I started writing something in the check, addressed the contradiction in the division of labor, I think, the best. He pointed out that on the one hand, it gives us that freedom that you described, the milk and the bread, not having to be all in one household. On the other, it created a very binding interdependence in complex modern society, so that interdependence kind of took some of our freedom to really be ourselves. But I want to address, Roger, again, the use of two words for labor and work, and also the vita activa and the vita contemplativa. What Marx, my understanding, and my understanding is mainly through Raya Dunayevskaya, the Marxist humanist interpretation. Marx's objection was not to, was mainly to the exploitation of labor. so that when labor will be owned by the worker, which means they can buy and enjoy the product of their labor rather than the product of their labor be owned by the capitalist, they will be able to, it's not leisure, but they will be able to do the kind of work and labor that is in their interest, is in their competence. They wouldn't be slave to the labor, but they will express themselves through labor. So art, music, tanning on the beach, all that which we call kind of hobbies or leisure, actually they're part of the human labor. They would be, it's an idea that artificially separated between certain activities we call leisure and others which are more material. But today in the ecology of information, Arendt was right when she said there is the distinction between these two vitas is kind of getting vague, although she, I think, preceded job in Microsoft. But today, most of the laborers are not standing in front of the in a industrial complex, but they're sitting in cubbies and developing software. So both the thinking and the labor are, I mean, where do you distinguish here? The problem that I see with Arendt is that she's still, just like my father, my Austrian father, was an elitist when she talks about the laws of higher activities, the higher and the lower. I mean, where did Heidegger's intellectualism lead for a higher human progress? To tell you the truth, I stay away from, I didn't read Heidegger other than a summary.
Yeah. Let's leave Heidegger out of it, but Ayala, when she talks about the higher faculties, she's actually not at all talking about Heidegger's intellectualism. She's talking about things like religion. She's talking about things like family. She's talking about, when you go to a conference or a party and you meet someone, do you say to them, where is your family? Who is your family? Or what is your religion? You say, what do you do? Right? Because that's what's important. You ask them about what's important, their job, their place in the world. You want to situate their class. I mean, and when she talks about the higher faculty, she's not talking about, thinking about das Sein des Seiendes, nicht selbst ein Seiende. She's thinking about, what does it mean to live with your family? What does it mean to get up and look at the sunset or to create art? And I don't think that's elitist. I think what she's saying is we've redefined the value of man away from being a thinking being and a meaningful being to being a laboring being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe so. In capitalism, the value of a person tends to focus on.
Well, she was in capitalism and in Marxism. I mean, she thinks of those. I mean, her argument about these is, what's interesting about her work is that she's basically arguing that capitalism and socialism, or Marxism, or whatever you want to call it, are part of the same trend. They're part of the same. They're part of the same valuing of man as a laboring, as a productive being.
I think she's wrong about Marxism, the pure way that it would play when people would not be enslaved to their employer. Their worth will not be defined by the manual job or any job that they are doing, which creates this kind of approach to what do you do is like, let me know what is your worth here in the social status.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that when we read chapter, what is it, chapter 19 on consumption, on 17 on consumer society, because that's where she's going to say, you know, the Marxist dream failed and it's turned into a consumer society, not a workers' utopia. So we should keep that. That's a good question. And you know, I mean, maybe she's wrong about Marx. I think it's certainly a lot of Marxists certainly think she is. But we should, you know, there's the question of what Marx hoped for and then what is. And what she says is that what socialism ends up with is consumerism.
Yeah, that's actually capitalism. That the consumerism is definitely a product of the excess that capitalism has created and raised the needs, artificial need to be in competition to who has more and who consumes more. You know, if workers will own their product, there won't be this excess that capitalists use and exploit to create that situation of excess and consumerism and to raise their profit. But that's my opinion about Marx.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we'll talk more about that as we go through and read the section on consumerism. Okay.
Thank
okay.
you.
David Bell, it's been a while. David, you got to unmute yourself.
It's partly continuing the same kind of thought, really. I think if we place Marx in terms of the title of his great work, A Critique of Political Economy, rather than a blueprint for a new world, then what she seems to be, to some extent, supporting is his understanding of the engine of capitalism. And I suppose the thing that I'd like to add, I think I might be wrong about this, but I think the slave, the pure slave, in a way, doesn't have to have the provision of subsistence if there are lots of slaves available. They can expend their labor and die. The peasant, on the other hand, needs to have the means of subsistence. So the landowner must give him the needs in order to survive, because there isn't an infinite supply of peasants. And in the same way, the laborer needs to have, one, the means of his subsistence so he can reproduce himself and his family. And then on top of that, he has to produce surplus labor, which is the profit of capital. But Marx's point, which she emphasizes, is what the laborer surrenders is not his labor, but his labor power. That is, that he rents his labor power to the capitalist, which means he loses the capacity to have any control over the realization of his labor power in labor. That is now under the control of the capitalist. In that sense, he is alienated from the products of his own labor power. and alienated from his own soul. It's not just that he's alienated from mention in general, but he's alienated from himself. And then the products of his own labor confront him as foreign objects. And so Marx's point is that this is the part of the motor and the material and social basis of capitalism. And his point is that that can't be overcome without something changing those relationships between people. And it seems to me that sometimes Arendt talks as if she agrees with that, really. But then the way I feel it is if she gets worried that she's going to be allied with totalitarian socialism, so has to quickly sort of pull back. So I see her as quite torn, that she accepts his critique of political economy. And if she does, then one would have to accept there can't be an unalienated human existence without a change in the material and social relations which generate that existence. That alienated existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair and good point. I think she does accept Marx's critique. I don't think she, I don't think she's a capitalist in the, she's not trying, that's what she says at the beginning. Just because I'm critiquing Marx doesn't mean I'm friends with the people who are critiquing Marx. I don't think she's recoiling just because of being worried about, I forget how you put it. She's recoiling because she really does believe that not only in practice, but even in Marx's theory, the only way to change the kind of humanity that he wants to is through a dictatorship of that would lead to a kind of terror. I think I think she's pretty sanguine about the fact that both capitalism and communism are in her minds founded upon exploitation. Is there an answer to that? That's not her business. And maybe that's not a good enough answer, but I think that's her answer. I think what she says is what she's trying to do is trying to understand it. And if you want to understand it, she says, you have to understand that both capitalism and socialism are driven by a similar trends and similar desires, including above all the valorization of man as a laboring, living, consuming animal over other valuations, and that it's going to be very hard to create a society that is meaningful in her mind when we don't have other, as Ayala put it, higher, and as Arendt puts it, higher ends, and that the problem is we don't have those higher ends. They've been, as at least on a mass level, they've been lost. And in a way, whether it's a chicken and egg, did capitalism and communism destroy those, or did the loss of them lead to capitalism, communism? You can't ever answer that. That's what she's trying to think through in this book, is how that happened. And again, I think the core of this book, right, the book where all of this is thought through, is in chapter 6, the section on the vida activa in the modern age. And that's really the chapter where she will, or is it chapter 5 or 6, whatever, the vida activa in the modern age, where she will try and explore why this happens and how it's happening. And that's the effort to think what we are doing. Hold on. Did I get your, maybe I hope I've understood your question, David. I don't want to I'm trying to, I'm not going to sit here and I'm not a Marx expert. I've certainly read and taught Marx, but I don't want to, hold myself out as a Marx expert. I hope I've understood it enough to answer it, but maybe not. Do you want to?
I think you have. I think that some of us would probably say that the world has not yet seen socialism, except perhaps for a very short periods of time before a perversion took over, you know?
I think she would agree with you. I think the only difference is she doesn't think it's going to be seen.
Yeah.
You know, it's a great dream. You know, clearly she thinks the dream is over, right? I mean, that's if you read her work.
Does she produce any alternative at all to capitalism then?
Does she produce an alternative to capitalism? She doesn't produce her alternative is not to capitalism or to communism. It's to economicism, right? Her alternative is to live a life where we care about politics, where we care about the public. You know, she thinks that as long as economics is your focus, you're going to end up with some sort of system of exploitation, whether it's capitalism or communism.
I think Marx would have called her a utopian.
Yeah, well,
things can be changed to the level of ideas without any change in the social world, in the social and material world.
Yeah, they can call each other utopians. I mean, you know, the difference is she doesn't have like a theory of how to get there. Hers, and she thinks that that's the very dangerous part of Marx, right? The sort of idea that we're going to transform society along with our ideas is for her the height is what leads to totalitarianism. Yeah, I mean that is the danger she sees in Marx, and she won't go there. You're right. Clara is next. I see.
Yeah, I'm here. Great conversation.
Thank you. Glad you're enjoying it.
Yes. Okay, I would like to go back to the Greeks. Professor Roger, if we can go to page 84, paragraph 2, where it says this incidentally, da 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 da.
Da, 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 da.
Yeah, this incidentally was also the reason for the much misunderstood Greek theory of the non-human nature of the slave. Aristotle, who argued this theory so explicitly and then on his deathbed freed his slaves, may not have been so inconsistent as moderns are inclined to think. He denied not the slave's capacity to be human, but only the use of the word men for members of the species mankind, as long as they are totally subject to necessity.
Okay. I want to hear your thoughts about this, because in this this time I would like to highlight Hannah Arendt attempt to clarify the Greek theory of the non-human nature of the slave in the case of Aristotle. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, so I mean, like these are fascinating pages, and I would turn back one page to the last line of page 83. So 83 to 84, where she says, to labor meant to be enslaved by necessity. And this enslavement was inherent in the conditions of human life. To labor meant to be enslaved by necessity. To labor means that you have a necessity, and you are in a sense enslaved to labor in order to keep yourselves alive. This next sentence is one of those ones that you read Arendt for, right? It's one of those things that you can put on your wall and think about till you're blue in the whatever. This enslavement was inherent in the condition of human life. This is one of those lines of Arendt's that you just have to keep thinking about. It is in the nature of let me not use the word nature. It is in the conditions of human life that we must labor, and thus that we must all be slaves. It is part of what is being a human, is to be a slave. It is you can't, it is just, it's deep in a human life is to be enslaved by necessity. The institution of slavery in antiquity, she says, in antiquity, but not in later times. She's clearly distinguishing it from obviously a modern slavery. This is the next paragraph. The institution of slavery in antiquity, though not in later times, was not a device for cheap labor or an instrument of exploitation for profit. Clearly, she thinks in modern times, slavery is a device for cheap labor and exploitation for profit. But in the ancient times, it was the attempt to exclude labor from the conditions of man life. It was an attempt by those who had slaves to escape from a part of the human life, the human condition, namely their need to labor, their enslavement and necessity. And so she's making a distinction between modern slavery and slavery in antiquity. It's not that one's good and the other's bad. I mean, it's that they're different. And in ancient slavery, to the extent you were a slave, what men share with all other forms of animal life was not considered to be human. And so if you were a slave and all you did was labor, you weren't living a human life. Now, she then puts in parentheses, this doesn't mean you weren't human.
Yeah,
Just wants to be clear about that, right?
definitely.
You know, it doesn't mean you weren't human. It just means that to the extent you were only living a life of labor, while labor itself is part of human life, there are other parts. And if you only labor, you're not, you know, the other side of this is that if you only have slaves and you never labor a day in your life, you're also not living a human life, by the way, which she's going to say in other parts of the text. So, you know, so that's what I make of this. It's an attempt to make it clear that simply by saying that you're a slave and you're not living a human life, or you're a slave owner and you're not living a human life, in either case doesn't mean you're not human.
I do agree with your interpretation, Professor Roger. And by the way, I think your presentation
It's your,
today.
no.
Sorry.
Mara, are you trying to say something?
Shall I continue, Professor
Yeah.
Roger?
Yeah.
What I say that I agree with your interpretation. And by the way, your presentation today was excellent.
Oh, thank you. Always appreciate it. Well, yeah, no, this is an important part, and I'm glad we got to talk about it. I was, you know, you know, it's always tough teaching these parts of Arendt, because there's so much of a desire to read her as talking about slavery. Can everyone? I'm just going to mute everybody. All right, I muted everybody, so if you want to talk again, you'll have to unmute yourself. All right, let's just go on. I think, where are we? Stephen, are you next?
Hey, I'll take it, Roger. Thank you very much. I loved your characterization of Arendt's comments on intellectuals as being the most extraordinary condemnation of modern intellectuals. I thought that too when I read that page, and also the Smith quote in the footnote. But I'm wondering if there are some thinkers whom Arendt wouldn't have thought of, who had perhaps unified the intellectual and work life in an organized, intentional way. I'm thinking here of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement in England, and there may have been equivalents in Germany. I wouldn't know that. So it's just a thought that there's someone who led a force for some time trying to integrate the imagination, the intellect, the world of craft, and also maintain a firm interest in social justice. So there's one from history, but in more modern times, I'm wondering what she would think of writers like Matthew Crawford and Richard Sennett particularly on craftsmen, And I just picked those two books off my shelf while we were talking earlier, and both Crawford and Sennett refer to Arendt. I gather that Sennett, it's been a long time since I read him, admires Arendt but differs from her. But there is another path there where the intellectuals can be seen to be doing hand work, and it's thought to be extremely worthwhile for those who are practitioners and thinkers in that kind of realm. So it's more of a comment. I don't have a big fat question here at all, I'm afraid.
No, it's a good comment. You know, she's making this distinction between laborer and hand worker, craftsman. And you're right to say that there are still craftsmen. There are still artists. Fewer and fewer, but there are. Many more call themselves artists, but fewer and fewer. You know, she's I mean, there's a good reason that Sennett and Crawford and others refer to her, because she makes this distinction, right? And when we read the work chapter, you know, that's what it's all going to be about. It's going to be about craftsmen, hand workers, and then eventually artists. You know, so she thinks there is a way in which there is a kind of work that is not labor, that is not simply consumed and consumed with life. You know, it has its limits as well. It's not action, and it's not thinking, but it has at least contributes to the worldliness of the world. So none of that, all of that is true. You know, you know, the argument that's sort of going to course through this book and is not going to really be made until the last two chapters, right? So we got a long way to go. Is that, you know, in the end, laboring is taking over everything. And that we are turning man into this mere biological, laboring, consuming creature. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to always be, you know, people like Crawford or people like Robert Pirsig or, you know, Zen in the auto motorcycle maintenance, and there's not going to be great artists. They're just going to be so out of touch or tune with the rest of society that they like are one-eyed jacks. I think that's the argument that she's going to make at the end. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point to these folks, to say that there is another tradition of work instead of labor, and I think they're right to point to her, because she's the one who first really articulated this distinction.
Thanks.
Okay. Nick, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So I think reading Arendt, especially this work, I mean, she accomplishes what she wants, I think, as with me especially, that to think what we are doing. And the frameworks that she provides are, I think, somewhat useful in thinking through stuff. But I sometimes wonder, and this is a wonder and maybe a quibble with her, that sometimes she's very preoccupied with fame and immortality and that kind of thing, the things that need, that's why persistence, things that persist are somewhat superior to things that are consumed. And the idea that one has to live one's life in a way to excel and to achieve fame and immortality is something that I think is a flaw, a weakness. I question that. and as maybe a little bit too close to vanity. But still more, in the age that we're coming into, in some of us will live in their lifetime, when when a machine can think better than us, when a machine can do the labor better than us, can create even things better than humans, what is the value then of all this fame and all this stuff? I wonder. So what I'm trying to point out here is that maybe some of these hierarchy and so forth are good to think about, but in the end, I think I have come to the conclusion that experience trumps all this stuff. That when I'm laboring, I'm experiencing and I'm in the experience. When I'm creating, so the same, even with thinking or conversing, that experience itself is what life is about. It's not the creation of what we leave behind. So this leaving behind in this idea of we have to have a world, persistent world, where we stamped our signature, our lives in it. I think this is part of, well, I still thank Arendt for allowing me to think about all these parts of life, but I don't, and I've read her for quite a while, and I love her thinking, but I quibble,
Yeah,
I question.
we like quibbling, we like questioning. So let me say that, you know, you framed it in a way, Nick, that's on two levels, right? One is why we care about fame, why do we care about permanence? You know, Plato cared about the permanent ideas, but why do we still care about it, right? I mean, that's one question you're asking. Why does it matter that we have a world that lasts? And then the second frame that you have is, well, pretty soon, you know, the computers will produce all the food we need, and the AIs will produce we could just sit there in a vat with a straw in our mouth and sit in the sun all day, right? I mean, I take that to be your point. And we'll be like, woo, baby, little drugs coming this way. It'll be good. Right? I mean, and so that's experience.
Not quite ecstatic or
okay,
wild.
but, you know, but that's so you know, all good, right? What's the problem? And is there one? I mean, and here's where, you know, the only response I have, which is Arendt's worry about the world is not about fame and not about permanence or this. It's about the human condition. And her argument is, human beings are the kind of beings who need a world to live in. We can't just, you know, live like this. We need structures of meaning. We need interactions. We need plurality. We need that. It's part of what it means to be human. Now, it's not part of human nature. And what she says is we could change human nature, right? This is, and I think I take your question as like, wouldn't it, look, at this point, shouldn't we just give in and accept that we're all going to be, if we want, laying out in the sun with the drugs and the whatever? And, you know, I think that's certainly a legitimate, let me be very clear. I think it's a legitimate claim. I mean, there's no logical or metaphysical reason that we can't argue for that as a way to live a human life. What she's saying is, look, as we've thought about human life for the last 2,000, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, it doesn't add up. And it's not the way we've thought of as a meaningful human life. And it will change the condition of being human if you live in a world like that. And we should think about it before we do it, because if we do it and we don't think about it, we may be disappointed. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that your rebellion of like, oh, it's not that ecstatic, is because you don't think it's that great a life. And
No,
you probably have some caveats about it.
I think my more important point, I believe, Roger, is that it's about a meaningful life, a fuller life is about experience rather than leaving something or creating something permanent.
Okay, but
And a person who wants to be, I mean, if we want to be an intellectual, you could be, and you could have that experience. But you need to balance it off with some manual work as well.
Yeah.
Maybe and have that
don't
type
you
of
need
experience.
to have an
But
experience?
it's not what?
To have an experience, Nick, don't you have to have a world into which you're born and which you grow up that you can rebel against and that you can embrace or rebel against? That's the claim.
Yes, but it's a world that I'm still trying to make, but for the purpose of experiencing a better life rather than for the purpose of leaving something after me. Because I create something because it makes life better for us, for all of us today, rather than I'm creating something to leave something behind for posterity, to leave something to remember, the world to remember me by, to show my what is agonistic excellence or whatever. That type of thing, I think, is what I'm rebelling against.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be agonistic excellence, but there has to be some concern with a world that you pass on so that when my children grow up, they have a world to live in that they can embrace, rebel against, change, etc. And there has to be, because if there's no world if the world is just this, and I'm sorry, I'm being a little trite, but I don't think I'm being that trite. If the world is pure YouTube, Netflix, and McDonald's and drugs, right? If we're all happy cows in the Nietzschean formulation, there's nothing to push against. There's nothing to live against. And I don't think you'll have experience. You'll have just, you'll have just sort of blah happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And let me say, I mean, if we took a vote amongst the world's whatever it is, 9 billion people or how many billion people we have, blah happiness is going to win. But she's worried about that. And what she's saying is, if we don't think about it and we just let people's everyday decisions drive it, we'll end up at blah happiness. This is my most eloquent speech, blah happiness. End up in this kind of.
Thank God it's Friday.
We'll end up in this kind of nirvana of meaningless, thoughtless joy, happiness. And that's where she thinks we're headed. And I think AI is part of that. So that's where the think what we're doing comes in, is do we really want to go there? And since we are going there, is there a way to go there and make it a little bit more interesting?
Yeah. Professor Roger, may I make a short comment about Nick's?
Short, yeah, because I got more.
I just want to make a little short. Nick, I just want to tell you that in my opinion, Hannah Arendt wouldn't agree to say that in modern age, there is a possibility that a machine thinks better than a human being. And I know that is going to come up in future sessions when we talk about think and action. But in terms of thinking, she wouldn't agree with that. Just a short comment.
Well, she thinks that they can think better than we can in brain power, but not more meaningfully.
Yes, that's it. That's it.
Thank
you, sir.
Lena, you're up.
Hi. Actually, my train of thought is quite similar to what Nick was saying, but I would like us to take this a bit more seriously, maybe, because if we think of ourselves as laboring animals, right, in Marxian sense, and we think about labor power, and it's very important for me to think about being an employee at university, that I'm in the union, and then there is a strike and there is my refusal to work. And so that's also my action, that's also my power, is to take away that labor power. So obviously that's very important part of belonging into society and being aware that you have that labor power. Now, so that's a refusal. But then if you take that refusal a bit more philosophically, right, not just in relation to your workplace, but a bit more philosophically, is I think it's quite interesting proposition. So laziness is mentioned on page 82 in the notes, and it says there that there was Aristotle talks about two different, if I understood it right, talks about two different kinds of laziness. One is kind of a disgrace, and the other one is when we abstain from activities. And I just, well, I wonder about that. I mean, look at us here now. Lots of us are abstaining maybe from this activity even. You know, we listen, we don't listen. Someone has a sound on, they forgot they were there. I don't know, it's a common thing for everyone. So it is a kind of human condition within us as well, to be lazy actually, not to always be engaged, not to always be active, to kind of sit back. And lots of artists are working from that kind of passive state. You know, you have some artists from Fluxus movement, like sleeping in a gallery or being passive and, you know, not wanting to engage, but not in a sense of maybe how you were showing it now, you know, like just watching Netflix or something, but as a kind of a political act too. So I just wonder if you could talk a bit about this laziness that maybe from as it is mentioned on 82, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Let's read this passage on the footnote that you're talking about. The Greek public opinion in the city-states judged occupations according to the effort required and the time consumed. And Aristotle said of the shepherds, there are great differences in human ways of life. The laziest are shepherds, for they get their food without labor from tame animals and have leisure, skolazuen. It is interesting that Aristotle, probably following current opinion here, mentions laziness, ergia, together with, and somehow as a condition for skole, abstention from certain activities, which is the condition for political life. Generally, the modern reader must be aware that ergia and skole are not the same. Laziness had the same connotations it has for us, and a life of skole was not considered to be a lazy life. The equation, however, of skole and idleness is characteristic of a development within the polis, etc. Okay, so the difference, I mean, I assume most of us know skole. Skole is the root of our word school. And so the scholar is someone who doesn't work so much on taking care of necessities, but studies, or in this case, engages in politics. And this is not laziness. This is, you know, what it means to be political or to be a scholar. Whereas laziness, in the example we get, is what a shepherd does, which is they get food without actually having to do anything. They just watch their animals and eventually kill one and and eat it. I take that to be the case. Okay, if I understand that, Lena, you're asking, you're saying, I'm just can you help me out? Okay,
Yes, I was wondering about that because it says abstention from political life, right? In one sense, which was that's Schola, right? And so I thought, how is that different? I suppose, is that different in a way that you are almost like preparing for political life? Because in a sense, we were talking last week, we were talking about this sphere of private, realm of private, which was hidden and, which is not in that sense public. But then what is this kind of a abstention from political life here, and it's kind of laziness? So I was just wondering, what is that?
Well, it's not abstention from political life. It's actually engagement in political life, because you're able to abstain from, farming and doing hard labor. So you have time to sit around in the Parthenon and talk about politics. It's not lazy, but it's not lazy in the sense that you're doing nothing, but it's not doing hard work, or manual work.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that I guess my more general question is like, well, is there a political point to laziness, as we maybe understand laziness, or refusal?
Yeah, no, that's a different point, and that I see why, I do see why you connected it to Nick's, although I don't know if he considers that a friendly or not amendment. Do we want to argue that there's a kind of political sensibility to why should I have to work? We live in you hear this a lot from students, right? We live in the richest society in the world. Why should anyone have to go hungry? And okay, and another, you could just extend it, right? We live in the richest society in the world, most technological society in the world. Why should anyone have to work? Shouldn't we all be able to sit, and have the fake food infused in us? I think you're not wrong. I think in many ways that is a political project of spoken or unspoken of many people. I don't think many people are going to put it as boldly as you did.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Can I say something in terms of that question about is it political laziness? If you put laziness in the same area as boredom, people have written very, very interestingly about boredom, notably someone called Michael
Vivian, let
Newman.
me just interrupt for 1 sec, because I don't think laziness is the same as boredom. Boredom can be very engaged, can be very tough, whereas laziness is supposed to be easy. But go ahead.
Well, okay. Well, I just wanted to mention that boredom is a whole sort of field that people have written very, very substantially about, and quite sort of difficult too. I looked over something written by someone called Michael Newman, who's a British academic. Anyway, I have a question, but it may not be my turn, so I just wanted to mention the boredom thing.
Yeah, no, it's actually a good point. I mean, Heidegger, I'm sure many of you know, has a whole book on boredom, and it's a fascinating book. And much of the boredom studies comes out of that. But boredom for Heidegger is the spur for thinking. You need boredom in order to give yourself the imagination and the creative freedom to think. And so there's a real positive aspect of boredom. It's hard to find that in the laziness. I think. I mean, Lena and Nick.
No, I wasn't.
No, but I think Lena might be saying that. So let me ask Lena if she wants to make that claim for laziness.
Okay, it's just because I think that is a kind of a human condition too, that we are in a way, we like to be lazy as well. You know, it's like obviously here with Arendt, the main thrust of the argument is this idea of an action. And then, you know, and it came up in the text. And I was thinking about, obviously I was thinking through Marx and labor power and then refusal of labor power and what happens when you are not at work, because obviously that's an action too, to refuse that power to work. But then somehow I thought, well, but also at work, I can be lazy. I am lazy. Oftentimes in this group, I'm lazy. I don't participate, or, you know, so I was just thinking what's with that, which seems to be almost the opposite of, I'm not bored, but I am lazy, you know, what seems to be the opposite of this idea of action. But that's all. I just wanted to bring that, maybe to highlight this word laziness too. That's, yeah, but you know, I don't think we can resolve it.
I'll just interject that I'm for laziness in the form of skole.
Yeah.
I believe.
Well, then you're with Arendt. Then you're with
Yes.
Arendt, Nick. I mean, and by the way, skole, a life of skole could be quite boring. You know, that's part of the, you know, that's part of the aspect of skole that Arendt and Heidegger find appealing. You know, we all need some laziness in the world, just like we all need some entertainment, and we all need some Netflix, and we all need some drugs. I mean, none of us can live without all of them. We all need everyone needs something. No one can be on all the time. And so I think that's a basic insight that we should all be aware of.
Can I ask my question, or when is my turn?
There's one more person between you. There's Hal and then you.
All right, okay.
Hal, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have two things. One's kind of a question and one's more of a, yeah, they're both questions. One is, do you think that there's in a certain way, Arendt, while she's talking about Marx, almost slightly mischaracterizes him by suggesting that his vision is pretty much just for like a society where human beings will do things outside of work once work, like just to see him as a person who wants to abolish work almost, as opposed to somebody who really also wants human beings to be able to take control of their destiny by kind of actively controlling the means of production. And then I guess part two, which is completely unrelated, but it's related to this work versus something else, is recently, of course, I noticed you're on it. I've never seen you in a room, but it would be I would want a notification when you are, like the Clubhouse app. And of course, that's something which you could talk about as something where there's a lot of political discussion that goes on in Clubhouse. Arguably, Clubhouse, because it's almost this like spoken format, is very close in some ways to the idea of a political space that's of dialogue of a similar type to ancient Greece, except it's digital. But what would you make of Clubhouse? Because it also seems like entertainment. Like this can seem like entertainment. Is it more of like, is that sort of thing more of like consumable entertainment, or is that more of political or action oriented sphere?
You know, on the question of Arendt's interpretation of Marx, you know, I think she's clearly read Marx very carefully. You know, I have no idea if she's gotten him 100% right. There are many people who argue she doesn't. There are other people who argue she does. You know, I can tell you what my opinion is, right? Which is that she's not trying to be a Marx scholar. She's not trying to like, you know, I mean, earlier, you know, we had this question, well, we haven't had a Marxist society yet. You know, she's not engaged in that. What she's basically saying is, you know, if you look at the way Marxism works and the way Marx thought, you know, this is how it ends up. And she has a pretty strong critique of it. And it's one that she read, you know, very carefully on, and she was obviously deeply influenced by Stalinism and by Russia and by the Marxist experiment. You know, we can I don't want to sit there and say she got it right or she got it wrong. I think she got something very deep in Marx. And it's there. Clubhouse, yeah, I joined it.
It's Clubhouse.
It's an app. Every once in a while I get a note on my phone that something is up, and I put it on, and there's a bunch of people talking about something I have no interest in. I have no idea how it works. And I don't know how to, I haven't ever spent more than 30 seconds on it. So I'm not the right person to ask about it. I think you raise a meta question about us, and that to me, I know something about, and I think it's a good question, and we've talked about it at times. Is this group? What is this group, right? Is it a matter of politics? Is it a matter of schole? Is it a matter of scholarship? Is it a matter of entertainment? I think those are all questions that you all should be asking yourselves, and I shouldn't be able to tell you what it is. I do teach every once in a while for another organization which pays me, in which I come and give an hour lecture. And in the hour lecture, I'm supposed to speak for 50 minutes, and there's 10 minutes for Q&A, which usually means there's 1 or 2 questions, which are usually about what I'm wearing or something like that. There's no assignment. The people haven't done the reading. I call that edutainment, and I do it for other reasons. I think there's reasons for me to do it every once in a while, but I don't think of it as education, and I don't think of it as intellectual. I think of it as largely edutainment. And there's better and worse entertainments, and I think I'm better than some. When I teach at Bard, the kids get graded, and there's a test, and I have some power over them. I got no power over you guys. And so whether this is edutainment or education is really up to you. I mean, it comes down to how you take it. And I think, I'll tell you, there's probably some people who are very silent on this that are doing a lot and reading it and very careful. They just don't like to talk. They don't like, and some people like to talk a lot and don't do the reading. I mean, we all know that there's different kinds of students and different kinds of people who present themselves. And as a teacher, your job is to try and serve all of them to the extent you can. The fact that 100 and some odd of you come back every week means that there's some value in it. I'm hoping some of you are doing the reading. I know some of you are. And so from my point of view, it's more than worth my while to be here and work you through the readings and talk about them. I take it very seriously, and I learn a lot from it. I learn a lot from you. I learn a lot from reading the texts again. So I don't think of this as entertainment. I think of this as to me, a serious endeavor. And I think everyone can approach it the way they want. I don't know if that answers your question, Hal, but I don't know enough about Clubhouse. I mean, honestly, I've listened to a couple things, and it's usually just people chatting with each other. And why do I want to listen to people chatting with each other? But maybe there's
a lot of the ones I've been in are more political, and maybe they're more superficial. I guess the question is is Twitter, because Twitter's kind of similar. Is Twitter purely entertainment? Political Twitter. Although I think Clubhouse is often more constructive, where people actually have longer conversations, which lead to points of agreement and disagreement, as opposed to just sniping at each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's potential with what I understand Clubhouse to be. It's a bunch of people talking to each other, and other people can jump in. I just don't know how it works, and I haven't spent the time to figure it out yet. I've thought about, I actually had this idea that we could take what we're doing and broadcast it on Clubhouse. I don't know if you can, but I thought it might be interesting for people.
It would definitely be possible. Maybe I'll host a Hannah Arendt group sometime.
Yeah, I just don't know what it would mean. And I don't know who would come, and I don't really know how to do it. And I'm not usually an early adapter on these things. So, I mean, I'm on it, but I don't really use it. All right, Vivian, you're up.
Okay.
Sorry, Vivian. I'm sorry it's getting to you at the end.
Yeah, it's okay. That's no problem. First, I want to say that for what it's worth, I very much doubt, with my increasing exposure, thanks Roger very much, to Hannah Arendt's writing, that she's simply wrong about anything. Okay, and I'm not a person who would normally say that, because I'm a very sort of critically thinking person. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I want to say is, and again, for what it's worth, I give up these couple of hours to do this, not for speaking for myself, certainly not as entertainment. For me, this is research work. Everything relates to, you know, my project, what I feel I need to know, etc., etc. And I also want to thank, I think it's David, for what he had to say about Marxism. I felt, is it David? I thought that was incredibly clarifying, actually. Is it David?
It is David, but I think he's left. I think he's probably left, unfortunately.
Okay, anyway, it's okay. I just found what he had to say very clarifying. But my question is this, and again, oftentimes my questions don't sound like questions until I've had a chance to get the whole thing out. But it's you, Roger, earlier on you said this book, you know, is not a book against labor. And also much later you said, and these things you've said before, and they're right, what she cares about, you know, is politics and economics and stuff. What I want to come to, or to clarify, to understand, is what this idea of the life of the mind. When I hear the words the life of the mind, I personally can't not hear Adorno in my brain. And I apologize for mentioning Adorno, because you know why. But what is, and this is a longer question, what is, for Arendt, what constitutes the life of the mind? Now, this is not just, hang on a sec. This is, I'm wondering, I also have this idea, when one of the reasons I thought what David said about Marxism, Marxist theory, was so clarifying for me, is because he forefronted Arendt's possible conflict. And I am wondering, you know, Hannah Arendt is a person who personifies, in my view, the life of the mind. This is her country. This is where she resides, in the life of the mind. Yet she politics, economics, the life outside of the mind, the life of action is crucial for her. They're not, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. But I'm wondering if she felt a certain conflict there, and a conflict in the sense of, if I might give just a visual example, I am a painter. I am not an abstract painter, but I'm not a straightforward representational painter. I mention this because my example is, I know what it is to be permanently pained and feel, in a sense of betrayal at leaving, for example, the world of representation behind. So she knows she exists in the life of the mind, notwithstanding any words that might indicate a sort of degradation of the intellectual, or even what she doesn't say, commodification that Adorno might say of, you know, certain things. And also in this life of the mind, this would include the elevation of leisure, in the sense that Adorno speaks about leisure, not in the sense of, you know, lying on the beach suntanning leisure, which for me is a filthy word. So so I'm wondering if she is conflicted in her terrain, if you see what I mean. And if she is, this is in no way to detract from her amazing, breathtaking achievement or abilities, not at all, but just to describe, say something about her soul as this person who has written these things and who exists in the life of the mind. So what do you think? What does it mean for her, the life of the mind?
Yeah, she never finished that book, did she? No, no, all joking aside, I think there's a somewhat simple answer to that. No, it's never simple, but the life of the mind, as she says it in the book, is thinking, willing, and judging. Thinking is concerned with meaning, and not truth. And so and judging is concerned with making matters of taste that you seek to appeal to others to agree with you on and create a community of judgers. So to me, the life of the mind is the engagement in solitary thinking about what is meaningful, the willful attempt to bring it about, and the act of judging and persuading others to join you on that approach. Without a doubt, there's a conflict, because if you simply spend all your time in your mind, you'll get nowhere, right? And I think one of the hardest questions for someone like Hannah Arendt, or an artist like you, Vivian, is why paint? Why write? Isn't it enough just to think? And her answer was, yeah, largely. She goes, I read it down only after I've thought it through and I'm sort of done with it. And I read it down just because that's my way of remembering it and putting it out there. But
Right.
I'm done with it.
Right. And that is the sense in which she did not ask, why do I write? Just as I don't explicitly ask, even in my own brain, the question, why do I paint? I don't. Maybe I should, but I don't. But this brings us back to something I forgot to say about what Nick said. When he talked about vanity, the word vanity does not have a place here, I think, in the sense that he brought it in. Not at all. How can you exist when you're gone if you leave nothing behind? It doesn't. And so for anyone to bring vanity into this is a mistake. She's never, Arendt is many things, but she's never superficial in any way. And this is not, and it doesn't, and what she says and what she strives for has nothing to do with vanity in a superficial sense, unless you mean vanitas in the sense of what lasts and what dies, in the sense of the original meaning of the term still life or something like that. So yeah. And also this thing about the automatons, etc. This relates to that. Machines can do everything, but you said yourself afterwards, yes, but not create meaning. So if we leave nothing behind, there's no meaning. There's no meaning. And so it doesn't matter if the machines are alongside us doing things better or the same as we do, but they not yet have constructed meaning for us. So
I think that's right. And that's the difference between a thinker and a writer, or a thinker and a painter, is that the painter and the writer, they have an urge to put something out there. And Hannah Arendt had that urge. She wanted to put her things out there. She said, well, I thought about it, it's done. But when it's done, she wanted it out there. And that's meaningful. and that's part of the world. And so I think that tension is between the thinker and the artist, and the thinker and the craftsman is a meaningful tension, and one that's very important. John, I know you're the left. John, is there a way I can come back to you next week, or give you first crack next week, or do you have an important question you want me to get to now? You're muted, John. I can't hear what you're saying.
Excuse me. It certainly can wait, as most things have. The theme really picks up on where Nick was, and wondering whether this book, instead of being The Human Condition, needs to be called The Human Challenge, and that but it can all wait. I mean, not a problem.
All right. Well, I think we can end on this question of the human challenge, which if the book on the human condition is about thinking what we're doing, I think it is a challenge for what does it mean to be human. So we'll come back to it as we go along, but thanks a lot. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure thinking and talking with you in a hopefully more than just entertaining way. And,
thank you. Thanks very much.
Ay, delicioso. Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you,
yes.
Roger.
as the spring comes, I hope you continue to read Arendt as you read her outside and enjoy her and the weather. And I hope to see you next Friday. Take care.